Snow gathered like quiet ash along the edge of the platform, softening the shape of the waiting benches and swallowing the sound of boots. The evening train had already gone, leaving behind a thin ghost of steam that hung over the tracks. Maylin stood alone, her gloved hands clutching the handle of a small wooden chest bound with a red silk ribbon. Beneath the fur-lined hood, her dark hair caught flecks of snow that melted against her cheeks. She had crossed an ocean for this moment, and yet it had already slipped away, like breath on cold glass. The wind carried voices that weren't meant for her. A pair of townsfolk lingered near the freight office, their tones half pity, half contempt. "Guess the groom didn't like what he saw," one murmured. "Should have ordered local." The other laughed softly, the sound brittle as ice. Maylin didn't look up. She stared at the iron rails disappearing into the gray horizon. Somewhere out there was the man whose letter had promised her belonging, a new life, perhaps a name that could be spoken without mockery. But the letter had been a lie. When the family came to meet her, their eyes narrowed the instant they saw her face. No words of welcome. Only the curt command, "This isn't what we asked for." Then the slam of a carriage door, leaving her at the station as the snow began to fall. A gust swept through, rattling the telegraph wires, and she shivered. The hem of her dress was damp, its pale fabric darkened by slush. Inside the station office, light glowed faintly through frosted windows, gold and unreachable. She hesitated to step closer. She had spent years learning when not to intrude. Yet when her fingers turned numb, she approached, peering through the glass. Behind the counter, Mrs. Hargreaves, the station keeper's wife, sorted envelopes beside the stove. The older woman's eyes lifted, widened, and softened. She opened the door, letting out a sigh of warmth and would smoke. "Mercy, child. You'll freeze." Her voice carried kindness wrapped in caution. "Come in then. Sit a spell." Maylin obeyed, careful not to drip on the rug. The heat made her eyes sting. Mrs. Hargreaves poured her tea from a chipped kettle and asked the question without asking, "No one come for you?" Maylin shook her head. "They changed their mind," she said quietly. Her accent curved each word, gentle as snowfall. The woman frowned. "Men out here got hearts of stone. But God don't." She reached for a blanket and draped it over Maylin's shoulders. For a moment, the world felt smaller, safer. The tick of the wall clock filled the silence. Then the door creaked open again, and cold air swept in carrying the scent of saddle leather and pine. A tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from his hat. His beard held silver like frost in dark earth. Mrs. Hargreaves smiled faintly. "Evening, Caleb Wyatt. Train's gone if that's what you're after." He nodded once, slow. Wasn't waiting for it. His gaze found Maylin, curious but not unkind. She lowered her eyes, but not before noticing the roughness of his hands, the scar along his thumb, marks of a man who built rather than destroyed. "This the bride the Jenkins family sent back?" he asked. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. "Seems so." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Damn shame." The word startled Maylin more than the cold. He didn't say them loud, yet they carried weight. She dared a glance at him. He wasn't handsome the way paintings tried to be, too real for that, but there was steadiness in his face, a quietness she recognized. The kind of silence that didn't mean cruelty. "They left you no carriage?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, no place to go?" "No." The bluntness between them left no space for pity. He looked toward the storm gathering beyond the door. "Road'll be closed by nightfall." Mrs. Hargreaves frowned. "She could stay here till morning." Caleb's reply was simple. "This place leaks heat. My cabin's got a fire." The offer hung in the air like a question neither dared answer. Maylin's pulse quickened. She had learned the cost of trusting strangers, yet the alternative was the dark and the cold. "I pay," she whispered. "No need," he said. "I'm not the kind who leaves folks to freeze." His tone made it sound less like charity and more like plain arithmetic. She studied him, then nodded once. Mrs. Hargreaves packed her a parcel of bread and ham. "You mind yourself, dear," she said softly. "Not everyone out there's cruel. Some just forgot how to speak kindly." Outside, the snow had thickened to a slow-falling curtain. The town was fading beneath it, lanterns glowing behind frosted glass. Caleb led his horse forward and turned back toward her. "You ride." She shook her head. Without another word, he reached down, steady and patient, and lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. The motion startled her, his strength, the closeness, but he kept distance even in proximity, his hands guiding the reins rather than her waist. The horse snorted and began its slow march into the white. They rode in silence. The world shrank to breath and wind and the rhythmic sound of hooves. Trees rose on either side, black against the snow, and she felt the warmth of the blanket he'd pulled around her shoulders. Once she looked up and saw his profile against the sky, unreadable, carved by years of quiet endurance. She wanted to ask why he cared, but the words caught behind her teeth. When the distant howl of wolves reached them, he murmured, "They don't come near light." His voice was low, almost lost to the wind. "We'll be there soon." She closed her eyes, trusting that promise more than she wished to admit. By the time they reached his cabin, night had fallen fully. Smoke rose from a chimney, pale against the black. He dismounted first, then offered his arm. She hesitated again before placing her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing amber light over the wooden walls. The scent of pine and coffee filled the room. He poured water into a kettle, moving with deliberate slowness as if mindful not to startle her. She sat near the hearth, thawing fingers that trembled less from cold now than from uncertainty. "You can sleep by the fire," he said. "Blankets clean. I'll take the chair." She looked up. "Why help me?" He shrugged. "Someone should have." Outside, the storm deepened, rattling shutters like distant applause. Malin unwrapped her red ribbon, smoothed it on her lap. It was the only color left from her old life, a thread between worlds. When she tied it to the handle of her chest, she felt the smallest flicker of warmth return, something like belonging, though fragile still. Across the room, Caleb watched the flames, their light reflected in his eyes. Neither spoke again, but in the hush between crackle and wind, a strange stillness settled, two lives briefly touching in the endless snow. The old station bell tolled once in the distance, muffled by weather, sounding more like memory than metal. Malin lifted her head toward the sound, wondering if the world had forgotten her name or if it was simply learning to pronounce it differently. Caleb stirred, listening too, and said quietly, almost to himself, "No train waits twice in these parts." Then he looked at her and added, "But maybe it don't have to." The storm lasted all night, gnawing at the cabin walls as though it meant to test the strength of the timbers, and of those inside. By dawn, silence returned, thick and heavy, as if the snow had swallowed every sound in the world. Malin woke to the faint crackle of the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Across the room, Caleb Wyatt sat in a chair by the hearth, boots planted wide, chin lowered to his chest. He had fallen asleep sitting up, rifle still resting near his knee. For a moment, she studied him, the way his hand twitched slightly in sleep, like a man who had learned never to fully rest. She moved quietly, unwilling to wake him. The floor creaked beneath her bare feet, but the cabin felt alive in a way she hadn't expected, warm, breathing, filled with small sounds of life, the kettle's faint sigh, the popping of wood. She found a basin near the window and filled it with melted snow. As she washed her face, her reflection shimmered on the water's surface, half ghost, half stranger. The red ribbon still tied to her chest was the only color in the gray dawn light. When Caleb stirred, she straightened quickly. He rubbed his eyes and regarded her in silence for a few seconds, as though making sure she was real. "You sleep any?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. "A little," she said softly. "Good. Storm's eased. Roads are gone though. Won't be no passing wagons till the thaw." He stood, his frame filling the space like an oak tree, and began pulling on his coat. "I'll feed the stock." She wanted to thank him, to ask how far they were from town, but the words knotted behind her tongue. When the door shut behind him, she looked around the cabin again. Everything spoke of solitude. The single plate by the sink, the one chair near the table, the boots lined up neatly as though for inspection. Even the walls seemed to carry the weight of silence. She found herself wondering if he'd chosen this life, or if the world had chosen it for him. She tidied instinctively, folding the blanket, sweeping a few stray pine needles from the floor. By the time Caleb returned, dusted in snow, she had warmed the kettle and set 2 tin cups beside the fire. He paused at the doorway, taking in the small domestic order she had created. His brow furrowed as though he wasn't sure whether to be grateful or uneasy. "You don't have to work," he said. "It helps," she replied simply. He poured coffee, dark as soil. The scent mixed with the faint perfume of her tea leaves steeping in a small ceramic cup she'd pulled from her chest. They sat opposite one another, the table between them a fragile peace offering. Outside, sunlight broke through clouds, scattering light across the snow. Caleb spoke first. "You got anyone waiting east?" She shook her head. "No one now." "Then west." Her eyes lowered. "No one wanted me west." He said nothing, but something in his expression softened. He reached for a loaf of bread, broke it in half, and slid her a piece. Their fingers brushed briefly. The touch felt startling, as if the air itself noticed. The hours stretched quiet. He fixed a loose hinge on the window, she mended a tear in the curtain. Their movements became wordless conversation, a rhythm of small survival. In the afternoon, Caleb split wood outside while she watched from the doorway. Each strike of the axe sent a flurry of white into the air. She admired the precision of his strength, the way he paused between swings to catch his breath, not out of exhaustion but discipline. When he caught her watching, she looked away quickly, pretending to study the snowdrifts. By evening, he brought in the chopped logs, stacking them neatly by the fire. "You cook?" he asked. She hesitated, uncertain whether it was a request or a challenge. "A little," she said. He gestured to the stove. "Have at it then." It was the first smile she'd seen from him, not much of one, but enough to thaw something inside her. She boiled rice from her chest and added bits of jerky, a humble stew with the fragrance of home. When he tasted it, he blinked as if caught off guard. "That's different," he said. "Bad." He shook his head. "Good. Just new." She smiled faintly. For the first time in weeks, she ate without the taste of fear. Later, as night fell, wind rose again, brushing against the cabin walls like ghostly hands. Caleb sat sharpening a knife, his face silvered by firelight. Malin watched him from near the hearth. "The town," she began cautiously, "they will talk." "They always do," he said without looking up. "They will say, 'You take me in.'" "I did." "They will say I stay." He met her gaze then, eyes steady as winter stone. "Then let them talk." Something in the quiet between them shifted. Not warmth yet, but the hint of trust. He sheathed the knife, placed it aside, and poured her more tea. She accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly, a habit from another life. The gesture made him hesitate, as if he'd never been honored in that way before. Hours later, after he banked the fire, she spread her blanket on the floor again. He pointed to the bed. "Take it," he said. "I cannot. You'll freeze down there." She shook her head. "I am warm enough." He exhaled slowly, accepting that she would not be moved. He lay down in the chair again, arms folded, eyes half closed. The glow from the embers flickered across his face, softening the lines of hardship. Malin studied him quietly, realizing that his solitude was not pride but protection. From others, maybe from himself. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silvering the snow-covered plains. The world looked untouched, endless. Malin rose and approached the window. Her reflection hovered ghost-like over the landscape. She whispered something in her mother tongue, half prayer, half promise. Behind her, Caleb's voice came low and steady. "Town's 15 miles. When it clears, I can take you there if you want." She turned slowly. The thought of returning to those stairs, those sharp, measuring eyes, filled her with cold more biting than any storm. "I don't know where to go," she said. He nodded once. "Then stay till you do." The simplicity of it left her speechless. He meant it as practicality, nothing more, but beneath it she heard something different. Permission to exist without apology. Wind sighed through the cracks, carrying a sound like distant bells, though no church stood for miles. Malin closed her eyes, listening. Perhaps it was only the memory of the station bell that night. Or perhaps, she thought, it was a different kind of calling. She turned toward Caleb, who was already half asleep in his chair. His hand rested near the rifle again, yet the tension had drained from his face. For the first time since leaving China, she felt safe enough to let her guard fall. The fire whispered low, painting both their faces in gold. Outside, snow drifted soundless beneath the moon. Inside, two strangers breathed the same air, no longer rescuer and rescued, but something quieter, something waiting to be named. And far off in the white silence, unseen, a lantern burned on the road to town, its light moving closer. By midwinter, the town had already made a story of them. Whispers carried on the wind the way frost crept along window panes, slow, invisible, inevitable. The first time Malin heard her name in someone else's mouth, she was buying flour from the general store. She had come alone, walking the long mile of snow-packed road because Caleb's horse had gone lame. The bell above the door had barely finished ringing when the chatter paused. A woman near the stove whispered something sharp behind her palm. Another let out a brittle laugh. "Don't look now," she murmured, but the Chinawoman's got herself settled right fine with Wyatt. Malin kept her gaze low, her gloved hands trembling as she counted the coins on the counter. Mr. Calloway, the shopkeeper, cleared his throat with awkward gentleness. "Storm keepin' you folks busy up there?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. Much snow. Her English still came haltingly, each word placed like a fragile plate. Caleb fix roof. He nodded, polite but cautious, like a man handling glass. He always was one for hard work. When she turned to leave, the women near the stove didn't bother to lower their voices. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Surprised he took her in. Thought Wyatt didn't care for company. Lonely men change come winter, the other said. You'll see how long she lasts come spring. Their laughter followed her out into the street, thin as a blade. The road back to the ranch cut through a frozen valley. The wind pushed against her face, but she walked faster, wanting only the quiet of the cabin again. The closer she drew, the more she thought of the sound of his axe splitting wood, the rhythm of it steady as a heartbeat. When she reached the fence, she saw him there, sleeves rolled, arms taut with labor. The sight steadied her. He glanced up when he saw her and nodded toward the bundle in her hands. Flour? Yes. She hesitated, then added softly, people talk. He swung the axe once more, burying it deep into the stump. They've been talking about me my whole life. Never said anything worth listening to. He straightened, his breath fogging the air. You let him talk. Words melt faster than snow. That night, she watched him whittle a piece of wood by the fire, his focus calm, unbothered. Yet when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression dimmed. The look of a man who'd built his peace out of stubborn silence. She realized he was used to being alone because he didn't know how to be anything else. So she filled the cabin with small signs of presence. Folded towels, a candle by the window, her tea steaming beside his coffee. He never said thank you, but his eyes softened, and that was enough. Days passed, the snow deepened, and the rumors in town thickened with it. Children whispered as she passed. Men paused at the sight of her. Even the preacher's wife crossed the street to avoid her, hand gripping her Bible as though holiness might rub off like paint. Still Malin walked tall. She had spent years learning invisibility, but now she learned something rarer, dignity without permission. One morning, she planted sprigs of green onion in a wooden box by the window. The soil was frozen, but she smiled anyway. They will grow, she told him. Caleb raised a brow. In this cold? Maybe not today. But they try. He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. Guess that's all any of us can do. The box became her small rebellion against the world's cruelty. Each morning, she turned the box toward the light, her fingers brushing the dirt as though coaxing it to live. Caleb began to bring her scraps of wood to mend into shelves, small gestures that needed no words. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire. She told him stories from her village, of lanterns floating down rivers, of children racing with sparklers through narrow alleys. He listened, smiling at the images he could barely picture. Never seen a lantern float, he said once. We burn ours when the harvest's bad. Maybe next summer, she said, we make one? He looked into the fire for a long while. Maybe. Their quiet companionship became the rhythm of winter. He spoke more, laughed sometimes, a low, rusty sound as if unused for years. She learned the smell of cedar on his coat, the rasp of his voice when tired. But beyond their walls, suspicion grew like frost. It began with Sheriff Kettle. One afternoon, he rode up the snowy trail, his horse snorting steam. Malin was mending a torn sleeve when she heard the crunch of hooves. Caleb stepped outside to meet him. She stayed near the window, heart thudding. Wyatt, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Heard tell you're harboring someone not supposed to be here. Caleb's reply was even. She's got every right to warmth, same as anyone. Maybe so, Kettle said, scratching his beard, but folk are uneasy. Papers matter in times like these. You know how things are. I know folks can be mean when the world's too quiet, Caleb said. His voice stayed calm, but Malin could see his jaw tighten. You tell him she's under my roof. That's all they need to know. The sheriff frowned. Just saying, keep it decent. Winter's long, tempers get short. Then he rode off, leaving behind only hoof prints and the echo of judgment. When Caleb came back inside, Malin waited for anger or bitterness. But he only removed his hat and sat down heavily. Don't worry about him, he said. World's full of men who ain't learned manners. She studied his face in the flickering light. You defend me, she whispered. He shrugged. You're part of this house now. Wouldn't make sense not to. Her chest ached at that, how simply he said what no one had ever dared give her. Belonging without demand. She reached for the coat he'd taken off and began mending the frayed cuff. Her stitches were small and precise, the quiet language of care. When she finished, she folded it across the chair. He looked at it, then at her. Their eyes held for a moment that felt longer than a heartbeat. Later that week, Mrs. Hargreaves visited, bringing a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Town's restless," she warned softly. "But some of us see kindness for what it is. Don't let them shame you, dear." Maylin thanked her, the words trembling like a candle flame. After the woman left, Caleb stood by the window watching the snow. "They'll talk louder before they quiet down," he said. "You sure you want to stay through that?" She turned from the stove, her voice steady. "Yes." He nodded once, and that was the end of it. That night, as the wind howled across the plains, she found herself unable to sleep. She rose and went to the window. Outside, the onion sprouts had begun to show, tiny green threads pushing through frozen soil. She smiled, whispering, "They try." From the chair, Caleb's sleepy voice murmured, "What's that?" "They try to live," she said. He made a soft sound, half laughter, half wonder. "So do we." The firelight caught his face then, warm and human in the half-dark. And just before dawn, as she drifted toward sleep, she thought she heard distant hooves again, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of town. The sound lingered in her dreams like a warning carried on the wind. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the northern ridge like a wall of night. By dusk, wind clawed at the cabin shutters and the sky turned the color of pewter. Caleb Wyatt stood outside securing the barn door, his coat plastered with snow, the rope burning raw against his hands. Each gust roared like something alive. Inside, Maylin lit the lanterns one by one, their amber glow trembling against the log walls. The fire hissed, throwing shadows that moved like restless ghosts. He burst in just as the door threatened to tear from its hinges. "Worse than last time?" he muttered, shaking ice from his hat. She moved toward him, worry furrowing her brow. "The horses." "Tied and fed." He hung his coat by the hearth, his breath fogging the air. "Wind's comin' down from the ridge, means the pass'll be blocked by morning." She nodded, though her gaze lingered on the frost whitening his beard. She handed him a towel. "You are cold." He smiled faintly, a tired curve of lips. "You sound surprised." "It is the way you stand in it," she said, struggling for the words. "Like you do not feel it." "I feel it," he replied softly, "just learn not to mind." He poured coffee and they stood side by side before the fire. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. For a while, the world shrank to the hiss of snow and the slow ticking of the clock. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, a dull, uncertain thud swallowed by the storm. They both froze. The knock came again, harder, more insistent. Caleb's expression shifted. Wariness replaced calm. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door and glanced at Maylin. "Stay back." He lifted the latch. The door flew open, snow swirling in like a white curtain. 3 figures stood on the porch, men wrapped in coats, their faces red from wind and whiskey. Caleb recognized them instantly, the Jenkins brothers, kin of the man who had ordered and then rejected Maylin. "Well, look what we found," said the eldest, Lyle Jenkins, his voice thick with drink. "Ain't this cozy? You took in our mistake." Caleb didn't move. "Ain't your concern what I do under my own roof?" Lyle grinned, yellow teeth glinting in lantern light. "She was meant for my brother, not some broke rancher. We come to collect what's ours." Maylin stepped into view before Caleb could stop her. The men's eyes dragged over her with mockery and hunger. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I am no one's to collect," she said. The younger Jenkins spat into the snow. "That's not how it works, sweetheart. You were bought and paid for." Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. "You best ride home before that mouth of yours freezes shut." The oldest laughed, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "Now don't get riled, Wyatt. Just business." Caleb's voice dropped low. "There ain't no business here." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the men stepped forward. The motion was small, but it snapped something taut inside Caleb. He raised the rifle, not to aim but to warn. "That's far enough." Snow gusted between them, hissing like static. Maylin's breath clouded the air beside him. Her fear was quiet, invisible except for the way she stood straight, her chin lifted slightly higher than before. Lyle's grin faltered. "You gonna shoot me over a woman?" Caleb's reply came steady as thunder. "If I have to." For a long moment, the wind filled the silence. Then Lyle looked around at the endless white, the storm thickening by the minute. "Ain't worth dying out here," he muttered. He turned to his brothers. "Come on. We'll come back when the law's with us." They mounted their horses, their curses carried away by the wind. The last one spat again, his voice fading. "Ain't over, Wyatt. You'll see." When the sound of hooves vanished, Caleb shut the door and leaned his forehead against it, breathing hard. The rifle hung loosely at his side. Malin approached, her voice low. They will return. Maybe. He set the gun aside. Maybe not. You will fight again. If I must. He looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them, neither fear nor defiance, but understanding. She moved closer, her hand brushing the sleeve of his coat, tracing the torn seam from the rope burn earlier. You fight for me. He shook his head. No. I fight for right. You just happen to be part of it. Her lips curved faintly, eyes glimmering in the firelight. Then I am glad to be part. The storm raged on. Hours stretched like years. Every groan of timber made her flinch, but Caleb stayed near the door, watchful. She brewed tea and brought him a cup. When he reached for it, his fingers brushed hers, warm, steady, grounding. You should rest, she said. He shook his head. Storm will pass by morning. I'll stand till it does. She studied him, the exhaustion, the stubbornness, the quiet courage that had kept him alive this long. Then I will stand too. And she did. She stood beside him by the window, watching the night devour itself. The wind howled and the lantern flickered, their silhouettes casting gold against the rough wooden wall. Near midnight, a sound split through the storm, the crack of a branch or maybe a gunshot. Caleb moved to the door again, rifle in hand. Malin followed, heart hammering. He opened the shutter an inch. Darkness moved beyond the yard, shadows where none should be. Get the lamp, he murmured. She obeyed. When she lifted the light toward the window, they saw them. 2 horses riderless, reins tangled in the fence. The Jenkins brothers hadn't made it home. The storm had taken them. For a long time neither spoke. The fire hissed, the lamp wavered. Finally, Caleb set down the rifle. No man wins against a storm. Malin looked out into the white, her voice a whisper. Or against his own cruelty. He turned to her slowly. You think God keeps score? I think, she said, the wind remembers. He stared at her, then nodded. Maybe it does. They stayed awake till dawn. The storm eased into silence, leaving the world new and fragile. Snow lay smooth over everything, hiding all scars. Malin opened the door and stepped outside, the air sharp and clean. The world glittered in pale sunlight. She turned back toward the cabin, her cheeks flushed pink. Caleb watched her from the doorway. She looked small against the endless white, but something about her posture, upright, unbroken, made her seem indestructible. He joined her, boots crunching through the snow. World's quiet after a fight, he said. She nodded. Because it listens. He studied her face, then reached into his pocket. From it, he drew a small silver ring, the kind traded in town for $2. This was my mother's, he said. Never thought I'd have reason to use it. Her eyes widened slightly. Why show me? Because the world's watching, he said quietly. And I wanted to see we ain't ashamed. She blinked, snowflakes catching in her lashes. You mean? He smiled faintly. I mean you stay because you choose to, not because I saved you. I just want you to know that. She looked down at the ring, then back at him. Then I choose. He nodded, tucking the ring back into his coat. We'll talk to the preacher when spring comes. For the first time in months, warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm had taken the world apart, but in its ruin something had been rebuilt, quiet, fierce, alive. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. She turned toward it, but before she stepped inside, she looked once more at the wide, glistening plains. The snow stretched endless, hiding every trace of the men who'd come to claim her. She whispered a prayer, not of fear but of thanks. When she looked back at the cabin, Caleb was still standing there, the light behind him golden, his shape outlined like a promise. And just beyond the ridge, faint as an echo, came the sound of distant bells, far away, uncertain, but moving closer, as if the world itself were preparing to witness what came next. The thaw came slowly, as if the world itself feared to disturb what the storm had left behind. Snow melted in thin silver threads from the eaves, trickling into quiet puddles that mirrored the pale sky. The cabin, half buried for months, began to show its shape again. Rough-hewn logs, smoke curling from the chimney, a red ribbon tied to the porch post fluttering faintly in the wind. It had been Mayleen's doing, that ribbon. She said it kept the spirits kind. Caleb never argued. He'd grown to like the flash of color against all that white. By late March, the valley stirred back to life. Crows returned to the fields. The creek began to run free. Maylin knelt by the garden patch one morning, pressing her fingers into thawing soil, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. When she lifted her head, Caleb was watching from the fence line, his shadow stretched long in the light. He looked different now, less like a man waiting to be left behind, more like one learning to stand still and stay. She smiled softly, brushing dirt from her hands. "It lives," she said, pointing to the first green shoot. He smiled back. "Told you it would." But the peace between them carried a tension as fragile as spring ice. Word had traveled that the Jenkins family planned to take the matter to the preacher and the sheriff. They called her illegal, called him disgraceful. For weeks Caleb ignored it. Yet gossip is like water, it seeps through every wall. And one night, when he came in from the barn, his jaw was tight, his hands still red from labor. "They say they'll take it to court," he muttered. "Say you were never meant to be here. That you'll be sent back east." Maylin froze, the needle and thread in her fingers falling slack. "Back?" she whispered. He nodded once. "I won't let him." Her voice trembled. "You cannot fight everyone." "Then I'll fight the whole damn county if I have to." The words hung between them like thunder. Then he exhaled softer. "I'm tired of hiding, Maylin. Tired of acting like what's right needs permission." He walked to the table, pulled open a drawer, and took out a small silver ring. She recognized it, the one he'd shown her after the storm. "It's time," he said simply. The next morning they rode into town. The trail was muddy, the air full of thaw and promise. Maylin wore her white shawl, the same one from that first winter, though it had been mended twice since. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, though the collar refused to sit straight. Neither spoke much. Their silence was not fear, it was something deeper, reverent, as if they were stepping into the rest of their lives and didn't want to break it with noise. When they reached town, every window seemed to watch them. People stopped what they were doing. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing, the preacher's wife stiffened at the parsonage gate. Caleb dismounted and offered his hand to Maylin. She took it without hesitation. Together they walked toward the church. The preacher, Reverend Cole, was sweeping the steps when they arrived. He was a good man by measure of scripture, though not always by heart. His eyes flicked between them, confusion knitting his brow. "Mr. Wyatt," he greeted slowly, and, "Miss Lee." Caleb removed his hat. "Reverend, we'd like the bell to ring for us today." The man hesitated. "That's no small request. Folks in town." "I know what folks say," Caleb cut in. His voice wasn't angry, just tired of restraint. "But I ain't a skin for permission. I'm telling you I mean to make it right. Proper." Reverend Cole looked at Maylin then, perhaps expecting shame. But her gaze was steady, her chin high. "Please," she said softly, "let the bell ring once for truth." The old man's eyes wavered. For a moment he saw not scandal but sincerity, and something in him relented. He nodded toward the door. "Come inside." The church smelled of wax and cedar. Dust drifted in narrow beams of light from the stained glass. Caleb and Maylin stood before the small altar as the preacher read from the worn book. The words, "to have and to hold, to cherish, to keep," echoed through the empty pews, steady and sacred. When he asked for vows, Caleb's voice came rough but clear. "I take her as mine by choice, not by chance." Maylin's reply trembled with feeling. "And I take him as my home." When it was done, the preacher nodded once and turned toward the rope. The bell above them had not rung all winter. He pulled. The sound that followed rolled through the valley like the first breath after silence. Deep, solemn, unyielding. Townsfolk froze in the street. Some crossed themselves. Some shook their heads. But others listened differently, as if hearing for the first time that love could sound like defiance. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. The snow on rooftops melted in rivulets, shining like tears. Caleb stepped out first, taking Maylin's hand as though anchoring her to the world. The crowd that had gathered parted slowly, uncertain. A few faces turned away, others softened. Mrs. Hargreaves, standing near the station, smiled faintly and pressed a hand to her heart. Maylin's fingers trembled in Caleb's grasp, but she did not falter. When they reached the edge of town, she looked back once at the church tower. The bell still swayed, its echo fading across the hills. "It sounds different now," she whispered. He glanced down at her. "How's that?" "Like it belongs to us." He smiled then, a quiet, weary, radiant smile that reached his eyes. "Reckon it does." They rode home through a field washed clean by sun. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine. When they reached the cabin, the red ribbon fluttered wildly, catching the light like a living flame. Caleb dismounted first, then helped her down, his hand lingering at her waist a breath longer than before. "We did it," he said. She looked at him, the ring glinting faintly on her finger. "We lived," she corrected softly. He chuckled under his breath, the sound warm as summer. Yeah, guess we did. As evening fell, they sat together on the porch, the land stretching silent and endless around them. The horizon burned gold and crimson, as though the world itself had been waiting for color to return. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her without thinking. In that stillness, the past and the pain and the gossip of small minds seemed very far away. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, the same sound that had marked her arrival so many months before. Only now it didn't sound like leaving. It sounded like beginning. Caleb watched the sunset paint her face and said quietly, "You think the world will ever stop talking?" She smiled, eyes half closed. "Let them. I have learned not all noise is meant to hurt." He nodded, content, and the wind carried the faintest chime from the church far away, the bell still swinging, its song stretching over hills and snow and all the places where love had once been unwelcome. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes hear that same sound and swear it rang sweeter there than anywhere else. But those who knew whispered the truth. It wasn't the bell that changed, it was the people who finally learned to listen. And as dusk settled over the cabin, Maylin whispered one last prayer into the cooling air, a promise to whatever heaven watched over them. "I am no longer waiting to be chosen. I have chosen to stay."